So we have a little bit on economic growth just to sort of complete the circle. Even in the front it's hot, isn't it? Yeah. And then education. And then what I hope is going to be an interesting and fun exercise for wrapping up. Do y'all have any questions before we get started? The last song you couldn't hear very well. It was Roy Rogers and Dale Evans singing Happy Trails to you, which probably only has meaning to 1, 2, 3, 4 of us in the room. But, my partner was a huge Dale Evans fan, so I just thought, in honor of Esther, I would have Happy Trails. And I was going to have the farewell song, from the song that ended Carol Burnett's show every time. I don't know if you know that one. I'm so glad we've had this time together. But it's not on iTunes, and I don't know how to scrape music off of YouTube, so there you go. There we go. All right. Anyway, here we go. Any questions before I get started? Whew, this is helpful. Aren't you glad that the heat comes on the last week of classes? And it should be better by finals, so that because it's supposed to cool down next week. You want a fan? Yeah. No questions? Okay. You guys are funny. Chitty chats, chitty chats. Okay, here we go. Economic growth, it's where we started, it's where we end. So you can conceptualize the process of economic growth using an aggregate production function. The standard aggregate production function uses just capital and labor, but once we start studying economic history, we recognize that to understand history, we need more than just capital and labor in our production function. At a minimum, we also need land, because certainly the availability of land was an important part of our story through the 1800s. It's also helpful to distinguish between government capital and human capital and privately owned capital, because certainly things like the laying down of track for the railroad was a publicly funded process. And if we don't make that distinction between publicly funded and privately funded capital investment, we may not recognize the importance of publicly funded infrastructure in economic development. And today we get to do the human capital part. So our aggregate production function then in the end is the one that looks like this. Output is sum factor A, which is the solo residual, or what's also called total factor productivity, times some function that combines privately funded capital, government-funded capital, human capital. I'm going to put that in because today's topic is education. What else do we need? Labor and land. If we make certain assumptions about that function f, particularly if we assume that it's constant returns to scale, then we can transform this into output per worker. Ooh, actually, let's transform it into output per person. Change my mind, I'm running out of space. We'll transform it into output per person, y over p, and that's going to be equal to the same A, total factor productivity, times some function that combines private capital per labor, kp over L, government capital per worker, human capital per worker, land per worker, and the labor force participation rate, or labor force divided by population. We've told a story for the last 20 some odd times together about U.S. history, that is the history of the United States economy, and that's been our framework. That we looked at changes in private capital per worker, we looked at changes in government capital per worker. Today we're going to talk again about education, which we talked about another day. We talked about changes in the land, we talked about changes in labor force participation rates and the rise particularly in the 20th century of married white women's labor force participation, and we talked a lot about total factor productivity, so the stuff that's in A, the things that increase the amount of output that can be produced. This production function tells us zippo, nothing about distribution. So there's no information in the aggregate production function about distribution. It doesn't tell us whether or not the fruits of our labors are equitably distributed to workers and capitalists. It doesn't tell us whether or not there are differences by gender. It doesn't tell us whether there are differences by race. It doesn't tell us if there are differences by nativity. It doesn't tell us if there are differences by, I don't care, name some other category. It just tells us that the total amount of output that's produced in the economy relative to the number of people in the economy depends upon those various factors. We don't have a nice simple equation like this that captures all of those good, worthwhile things to discuss about inequities, be those inequities by class, race, gender, nativity, or something else. So those are important. I can't capture them with a little equation. When we talk about extensive growth, we're talking about increases in the inputs, that is increases in the things inside of the parentheses. So increases in kp over L, kg over L, kh over L, t over L, or L over p would be captured as extensive growth in output per person. Intensive growth would be increases in productivity. Notice that what I've done for today, because I'm focusing today on education, is I pulled out human capital per worker separately. That's often not pulled out separately and is often included in total factor productivity. So a lot of times, improvements in the labor force through educational attainment are actually subsumed into A and are captured just in increases in total factor productivity. So one of the takeaways of that is don't get too hung up on this extensive, intensive growth when it comes to human capital development. So you can define human capital development, increases in educational attainment, as either being extensive growth if you have this sort of a fleshed out production function, or the more normal way, the way that you would see it in any other class, would be to simply have capital in your production function, and then increases in human capital per worker would be part of total factor productivity. All right, education. Education matters. Education matters because human capital is enhanced through education. We like it that you're all here, and many of us think that you get a better education by actually being here as opposed to simply watching me online, but I won't go there right now. That's not part of my lecture. It's just my rant. Okay. Education also matters in terms of distribution. So one of the things that economists say is that before the borders were really opened in terms of trade for the United States, and before transportation costs came down, and before trade barriers were removed by and large around the country, unskilled workers in the United States, they earned relatively high wages. And they earned relatively high wages because there were high capital to labor ratios in the United States. So even unskilled workers had a lot of machinery to work with. That made the unskilled workers relatively more productive, and that increase in productivity meant that the wages of unskilled workers, that is relative to skilled workers, were relatively high in the United States. With globalization and with the drop of trade barriers and the increase in trade, the drop of transportation costs, unskilled workers in the United States now compete with unskilled workers around the globe. And so they no longer enjoy the benefits of the high capital labor ratios in the United States, boosting their wages, because now there's more of a competition around the globe. And what that does is it increases the gap between high and low wages. And that gap between high and low wages is reflecting a skill gap, which presumably is reflecting in part an education gap. So we can't measure easily skill. I'm not even sure we have to spend a whole day defining skill, but we can measure educational attainment. And the differences in educational attainment, the difference between having a college degree and being a high school dropout, those differences in educational attainment are expected to have a greater and greater effect on widening distributions of income going forward than they did, say, 30 years ago, or 130 years ago, or 230 years ago. So here we go with education. Let's see. What do I have? Oh, good. They're in the right order. If you printed out this, well, you probably reprinted the slides. Hopefully you reprinted the slides. If you're using the slides you printed out for Tuesday, which are basically all the same, this slide is a little bit later, but if you reprinted for today, you're good. So this is a chart from the census that shows us high school graduation rate. So what share of the population has graduated from high school? That's in the top. And the bottom two lines are what share of the population has at least a bachelor's degree. In the top picture, I don't know if you can see it very well here. The top line is 25 to 29-year-olds, and the bottom line is ages 25 plus. And the data start here in, it's not very old, starts in 1974. The initial gap between those two lines is a reflection of the fact that educational attainment had been rising. And so the more you include the older population, the lower the overall average of high school graduation rates. And the increases in high school graduation rates for the 18, 19 or so year old population, those things are pretty much leveled out. That's what the top greenish line shows you. And so these two lines are coming together to a certain extent over time. We've gone from, in 1974, having about 60% of the population 25 and over have a high school degree, to today closing in on 90% of the population in the United States ages 25 and over having a high school degree. In terms of a bachelor's degree, you may have grown up where everybody you knew was going to college. That's not the case throughout the United States. It is true that about half of high school graduates do go on to at least a year of college, but what you may be learning from friends of yours back home is not everybody actually finishes. So we hope that you're all in the group that's finishing. So of the population that has finished college degree, what do we have now? We have around 30% of the population in the United States, either whether I look at it 25 to 29-year-olds or 25 and over, about 30% of the U.S. population has a bachelor's degree or more. So this includes bachelor's, master's, doctorates, and so on. 76% of the population has not graduated from college. It varies a lot by region. So we live in the Bay Area where the college graduation rate of the population is relatively high. If you lived in other parts of the country, or if you are here from other parts of the country, that may not be the case wherever your home base is. We can look at differences by gender. And what we see is that there's no longer much of a gender gap between men and women in terms of graduation rates. So the first two columns of this table are ages 25 to 29. The last two columns are ages 25 plus. And if we look, let me just choose like 1970, just choose a year. If you look back around 1970, there's a substantive difference between the male and the female graduation rates. Men were much more likely to have graduated from college than were women in 1970, whether I look at the population 25 to 29 or the population 25 plus. Now look at the year 2000. I wasn't able to gather the data for 2010 for the first two columns, so let me look at 2000. Similar pattern coming up. If I look at the population 25 plus, which again includes people like my parents and aunts and uncles who are all just now leaving us in their 90s, you get a smaller gap. But particularly, let's look at the first two columns and look at the year 2000. By 2000, not only had the gap between men and women in terms of college graduation closed, it had flipped. So no longer was it the case that more men than women had graduated from college. Now, in your cohort, it's likely that it will be more women than men will have graduated from college. The overall effect includes the generations that were born in the teens and the 20s and the 30s and the 40s who are reflecting these much larger differences. Sam? Why is there no data for 2010? Which rant do you want? One is because the statistical abstract from which I easily get all of this data is no longer published because of congressional budget cuts. That's rant number one. Rant number two is because they expect you to be able to thereby go through and negotiate your way through all of the various government websites that actually produce this data, and I couldn't negotiate my way through it enough to be able to generate the 25 to 29-year-old data. They're collecting it. You can get it. I could have gotten it if I spent another day or if I had figured out which graduate student to ask. So, yeah. Okay, pictures. This shows college graduation rates for men and women from 1876 to 1975. Let me trace along the male line here so you can see what happens. And there you go. So, this is, what is this? This is by cohort. So starting with the cohort born in 1960. So cohort is a group of people who were all born around the same time. So starting with the cohort that's born around 1960, that's when we get the flip. So that now it's more women than men who are graduating from college, whereas before it was more men than women. Notice that gap between men and women opens up with the group of folks who was born right around 1914, 1920, the early teens. People who were born in the early teens, what was their experience? What did they go through? They were babies in World War I. World War II and the GI Bill. That's right. So people who were born in the teens fought in World War II, and if you fought in World War II, you had access to the GI Bill which provided for government funding for college education. So I think I mentioned before that this campus during the war, my aunt was here during the war, and my uncle were born, let me see, my parents were born in 1915, my aunt and uncle were born in 22, 23, 24. During the war, she said this was like going to Mills College. There was all women. There were no men on campus because all of the men were away at war. And then they come back, 47, 48, 49, when the men come back from war, then you get this huge influx of men into college campuses. Flips, you get a whole bunch of building that takes place. All of the University Village housing down there was populated by young men who come back from war and were going to school in the GI Bill, living down there with their families. And you get this gap that opens up between male and female college attainment. So you can look at this switch over here in 1960 either as, wow, what happened to change things? If you started looking, you can't see my hand. If you start looking with the birth year 1920 or 30 on, it looks like, wow, it's always been the case that men are more likely to go to college than women, and now that's changed. If you look at it from the whole perspective back to 1870, you see we had this period for people who were born between, say, 1920-ish, teens or 20-ish, and 1960-ish or so, where there was this big gender gap with men having many more college degrees than women. And then we've gone back to an earlier pattern. You can see the same thing here. This is just taking the ratio of male to female. I've now made this point, so I'm going to skip over that because it's showing you exactly the same thing. People who look at why the gender gap in college education has changed ask why the shrinking college gender gap. So why is there a decrease in the male to female ratio? One argument is changes in expectations, so society's expectations and individuals' expectations about future labor force participation. So if you are 18-year-old and you're female, it used to be that you were going to college but not necessarily looking to join the labor force. Those expectations as to whether or not you're going to be working when you're in your 20s have totally changed, and so most of you now think it's kind of weird that we sat around and planned bridal showers so that we could get married the same weekend as graduation. I'm glad you think it's weird. It was a little weird. So there's changing expectations about labor force participation. There's also, of course, a huge difference in gender roles. So what society understands as proper gender roles and whether they understand it to be proper and right for young women to be going into the labor force at age 22. And oh my gosh, off as a young single woman living by herself in the big city. Who knows what could become of her? Oh my, oh my, oh my. Yeah, you don't get that so much anymore except from your uncle who's 84. Increase in the age of first marriage. We looked at that another day. And the role of the pill in contributing to the changes in labor supply as well as the changes in marriage patterns. Perception that the benefit of going to college is greater for women than it is for men. That has to do with returns to education, which I will come back to. That's where I could have put that slide. At the very end. No, I'll move it up. Just a second. I'll show you that slide in just a minute. And then the other argument is that the costs of college going and preparation are higher for men than they are for women. Both opportunity cost arguments, and also just some of these articles talk about like the more difficulty in staying focused and studying and prepping to go to college and whether there's gender differences in that aspect. Okay. Anyway, moving on. I'll just leave that right there. Let me show you the slide, which is all the way at the end, that shows you the returns to education. So this is from the 2010 data, and it's showing you what's the average earnings of a full-time year-round worker by the highest degree earned. There's no data here for Asian high school dropouts. There have to be enough people in the cell. These are all estimates that are gathered from government surveys. If you don't have a large enough sample size, then you can't put together an estimate with any sort of precision. All right, the part about gender comes from the first two columns. High school dropouts. Male high school dropouts make on average about $25,000 a year. Female high school dropouts make on average about $18,000 a year. This is if you're working full-time year-round. With a high school diploma, about $34,000 for men, about $26,000 for women. With a college degree, $51,000 for men, $41,000 for women. With a master's degree, $66,000, master's or doctorate for men, $51,000 for women. In each case, there is a return to education. So if you look within column, there is certainly a gain to be made from increasing one's education. So people with a college degree earn more on average than people who have a high school degree but no college degree. The comparison across rows, or sort of on the diagonal, it's not as bad. It's still just as bad as it used to be. It can be a little unnerving, but there it is. This is not controlling for anything, all right? So this is not saying within a particular occupation. This is partly a reflection of the different choices that people make about what to major in and what sort of careers to pursue once they graduate. So it's not saying that if two people are doing the exact same job with the exact same background, they'll be paid different wages. In fact, for your cohort, there is still a difference, but it seems to be pretty small. So once you control for education and what occupation people are in and what experience they have, the gender gap by cohort, so people in their 20s and 30s, it's something like, it's not this big. It's like women are making 95, 6, 7% of men once you control for occupation and education. So a lot of this is a reflection of different choices that people are making in terms of what to major in and what jobs to pursue. All right. Okay. Let me go back. Go to slide. Okay. If we look within race, there is not much of a gender gap within race in terms of college attainment. So compare across rows, men on the left, women on the right. Those numbers are reasonably comparable across rows. So there's not a huge gender gap between men and women within the white non-Hispanic, within the black non-Hispanic, within the Hispanic, within the Asian category. Those things are comparable. You can see already, though, that there are large gaps by race and ethnicity. Combining male and female and giving you a perspective over time is the next table. Table 3 shows the percentage of the population, again, this is ages 25 and over, with 4 or more years of college. And there you see very pronounced differences in college attainment rates by race and ethnicity. So if we look just at the last row, 2010, you can look at earlier rows as well as you wish. The white population about 33%, ages 25 and over have a college degree. Black population about 20%, Asian population about 53%, Hispanic population about 14%. So we get pronounced differences in the likelihood of being a college graduate depending upon race or ethnicity. These gaps are present at both ends of the educational spectrum. You can also see big differences by race and ethnicity if we look at the preponderance of high school dropouts. So this is of the population 14 to 24. Why am I choosing 14 to 24? I'm not choosing 14 to 24. How the data are presented in the source documents. Of the population 14 to 24, what percentage of that population has dropped out of school? Right? So they ask a series of questions and are able to discern not that a 15-year-old is homesick, but they're not in school. They're not enrolled in school. If you have a GED, so if you're somebody that finished high school at 16 and got a GED, you're not counted as a dropout, right? So that's somebody who has a GED. So here again, we see substantial differences. I'll just look at the 2009 data, which was the last year I could get because of the whole rant number 2, I think it was for today about statistical abstract. For the population, the total population, 7% of the population 14 to 24 has dropped out of high school. And then again, you can pick up differences, particularly between Hispanic population and the white and black population. So not as much of a difference between white and black as there used to be in terms of the high school dropout rate, 7 versus 8%, that's pretty close. But still a difference between that and the dropout rate for the Hispanic population. But compare with previous years, so jump up 2 rows so that my lines don't overlap each other. And you can see that, or jump up 3 rows, there we go, but jump up to 1980. And you can see that the differences are much less pronounced today than they were 30 years ago. So we're making progress. We're not where we want to be. There is variation by state. And what I did in the table was I just took the top 10 states for high school graduation rates and the bottom 10 states for high school graduation rates, and then I've got some charts coming up which show you more completely all the states. So the top 10 states in terms of high school graduation rates, this is looking at the population 25 and over. Top 10, Wyoming, Montana, Alaska, Minnesota, New Hampshire, Vermont, Utah, Iowa, Hawaii, and North Dakota. Yeah, that's what I say too. Bottom 10 states, from the worst to the 10th worst, from the bottom up, Texas, Mississippi, California, Kentucky, Louisiana, Alabama, West Virginia, Arkansas, New Mexico, and Tennessee. Why is Wyoming so high? Well, I'm going to show you in just a minute. But why is Wyoming so high? Because if you drop out of high school, what are you going to do? You don't farm in Wyoming. You ranch. You rope cattle. What do you do with cattle? You ranch. You're a rancher. Not farming. Yeah, you're a ski bum. If you're a ski bum, you're in Colorado. Colorado's someplace else. High school graduates, though, don't always correlate well with college graduates, which is interesting. So California, I didn't resort this, but you can see on the map I'm going to show you in just a minute. California has one of the highest rates of college graduates in its population. So we're one of the worst in terms of high school graduates, but we're one of the best in terms of college graduates. So you're going to get big gaps here, right, in income distribution. Oh, just a second, I'm going to show you what I did. Hold on. Let me show you the maps, and then I'll show you the analysis that I did. All right, there's the map. That's the high school graduate map. The lighter the color, the lower the high school graduation rate. The darker the color, the greater the high school graduation rate. So that's capturing the darker states should be the ones I read off to you a few minutes ago. The lighter states should be also the ones I read off to you a few minutes ago. And then you've got the categories in between. So you can find where you're from. I don't know where you're from. You're from here, you're from here, you're from here, you're from here.